Hello. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. Sorry for the slight delay. Um, my name is Kenny Clewett. I work with, or I lead Hello Europe, which is Ashoka's initiative around migration solutions. And what we do is help to identify, support, and scale initiatives that are solving issues underlying migration. Migration is not the issue; it's not the problem. It's the structures underneath. And we help to scale them across borders in Europe and elsewhere. And I have the privilege of facilitating the workshop. So let me give a brief introduction, and then we're going to let our speakers talk, and then we'll open up for questions and maybe divide into discussions. We'll kind of see how that goes. But to begin with, I think the idea behind partnerships. So this is about partnerships, right, and how to build the right kind of partnerships, what it looks like. There's an Ashoka fellow from Portugal, which, by the way, is a great country building partnerships around migration. They're doing amazing work. And he always says massive problems require collaborative solutions. And in no way am I saying migration is a massive problem, but there's a lot of, I think migration and refugee movements have kind of uncovered a lot of massive problems that we have in our societies, a lot of massive structural failures. This was a bit of the tone yesterday talking about housing is there's not a problem with refugee housing, there's a problem with housing. And the fact that more people are coming to our cities that don't have the natural networks is kind of uncovering that problem. And many other issues with labor, with collaboration across departments and governments and government and private sectors and nonprofit sectors. There's a lot of issues that have been there for a while. And this circumstance around migration has kind of uncovered a lot of that. That's at least what we're seeing from Ashoka, which is really interesting. The influx of migrants, the work around it has actually created a lot of social innovation. It's actually shored up innovation. So it's already been an opportunity, at least for our sector. We're beginning to see collaborations that are completely new, that are completely different, and that are kind of amazing. So far it's been a great opportunity, although there's many challenges within there. But having set that kind of as the beginning, I think one of the big mistakes we make in our sector or in each of our sectors is kind of thinking if everyone just did their job right, then we'd solve this problem. If we just worked hard enough, if they worked hard enough, and the answer is that that's not true. We have to work in new ways, and we have to work together in new ways. So it requires coming together to really look at the problem from a different perspective and start thinking about it differently. And so that's a bit of what's underlying this discussion and the kind of partnerships that we're talking about. And today we want to address a few questions. As usual in these things, there's a ton of questions we want to address. We'll never get to them all, but let's pretend we will. On the one hand, what are the best types of partnerships? What kind of partnerships really make sense from the different sectors? Secondly, how should governments in particular decide what partnerships to join or what partnerships they need? And also, how's the reaction from other sectors? What kind of partnerships really make sense in that government / nonprofits or citizen sector or business? And then third, like, what are the network roles? We talk a lot about smart networks. I've given workshops on smart networks, and I don't understand what they are. Still, I mean, I think it's just a concept we want to have. But how do networks kind of influence those partnerships? How can we use networks better to create partnerships and some of the strategies to create partnerships? And then there's another question that has come up as we've been talking, which is, how do we ensure, in this case, migrants and refugees are at the center and are involved in those partnerships? Because one of the worst things that we can do is create a partnership and leave the people affected by the problem out of that partnership. So we're very privileged today to have some people that have deep thoughts on that and that are representing both refugees and migrants in central decision-making organs of partnerships. So that's about all I'll say for now. But let me introduce our speakers, and I'll introduce them all and then kind of let them speak. And I won't say too much because they're better at speaking about what they do. But we're going to start with Viola Zabeti, who is part of Press and Opinion of the Unionen. Am I saying that right?
Yes.
In Sweden, which is, I think, the largest union in Sweden. And she'll talk more about kind of the role with refugees and partnerships around work and employment and all that. Then we'll move to Hugo, who partners with Viola, so it'll be kind of an interesting cycle. And he's the co-founder and diversity strategist at We Link Sweden. That also works connecting kind of diversity in workplaces and many other situations. And then we'll go kind of from the cold north of Europe, where there's a lot of partnerships that happen in very formal ways and a lot of meetings, down to Greece. which is the Mediterranean climate, where partnership is absolutely necessary to move forward any steps. I come from Spain as well, and that's something that we see, that partnership happens in a different way, but it's happening very deeply, and particularly in Athens. And she's the project manager of Curing the Limbo in the city of Athens, which is also there's a lot of partnerships going on between government and nonprofits, and kind of figuring out this limbo between refugee arriving, integration, what are next steps. So I'm going to ask them each to speak for a few minutes, kind of presenting just a little bit of what they're doing and what are some of the challenges and insights from partnerships, and we'll move on. Viola.
Well, let me say I'm very happy to be here. And actually, the cold north was very warm last summer. We had a record due to climate change. Well, my name is Viola Zabeti, and I live in Sweden. And I also was a refugee in 1983 from Iran. And I'm really happy to be here because I like the focus on sense of belonging, sense of home. And this is one of my favorite quotes that I would like to start with from Imaginary Homelands. We all cross frontiers in that sense. We're all migrant peoples, but then the experience differs for different people. And I work at the Union. It's the world's largest trade union, actually, and Sweden's largest trade union for white-collar workers. You can find us from Ericsson, IKEA, to Le Croix Rouge, Red Cross. And we also we are at 16,000 workplaces in Sweden. And we have 660,000 members. And I would like to show you, this is from our charter. Article 1 in the Union is about solidarity and diversity and equality. So I really feel at home at the Union working with this. And we're not bound to any political parties, and this gives us a big advantage to influence the whole labor market and also the politics. I will talk a little bit about the challenges first, and then about the possibilities of refugee inclusion in Sweden. Stockholm, where I live, and Malmö, where Hugo is from, and Göteborg as well are the biggest cities in Stockholm, and they attract more employees. And refugees with residence permit, they move to the largest cities, obviously, and they also have a large employment rate. After 2 years, 60% have unemployment, and after 10 years, 90%. But now we can, thank you. The problems we see is that after 15 years in Sweden, only 35 to 50% have jobs that is equivalent with their education levels. And another interesting number, we have a report we call We Can Better, is that from the year 2000 until 2017, from 109,000 to 319,000 refugees have higher education in Sweden. So we call it a waste of resources when you don't get the job after your diploma. And therefore, we're happy to be here because we think that partnership on inclusion is one of the answers. In Stockholm, we had the worst result, although we have most jobs, and we don't have a logic explanation. The only thing we see is that so many jobs are given by informal contacts, and the target group is far away, refugees from this contact. So as the world's largest trade union, we can really help with contacts in that sense, but we also need to work with other companies. And how we have some conclusions, and we have, for example, OF, a big engineering company who have 10,000 employees, and they have actually put this on the highest agenda at the management team. And they start in a small scale, but they have had like many 85 trainees, and 75 of them got a job as engineers, mainly from Syria, but other countries. And sorry for the misspelling, but one key point is making the initiative a natural part of the business, and also have goals that can be measured. And I would like to say the reason why Unionen work with Willing Sweden is that it's a trend right now to work with inclusion in Sweden. Everybody loves it. But we actually saw that Willing Sweden has the target group in focus, and they prioritize matching, and also they can educate us as unions, because we are really good in negotiation. We are increasing even amongst the young people, but we haven't really spend time to think about why and what is inclusion. So we also have workshops and education with Hugo, and I'm very happy that our board of committee administration in Stockholm is really focused on learning about inclusion. So we just don't, like many of you have said, talk about people, but actually involve them. And I'll also say, dare to measure, think about business and measure. And I would just want to say one other thing about the freedom of association is very important in Sweden. And Sweden actually only had 21,000 strikes of notice, so we are the less conflicted unions in the whole world, compared to our friends and neighbors Denmark, who had 300,000 strikes or notice of strike the last couple of 10 years. I think that government and companies and civil society love to talk with us because we are good in negotiation. However, we need to improve our own culture of inclusion, and I think we are in a good way. So thank you.
Yeah, feel free. Thank you so much. So I'm going to go straight to Hugo because there is a partnership going on here and we want to start exploring that. So why don't you go ahead?
Sorry, thank you. My name is Hugo Ortiz Dubon, and I'm the co-founder and diversity strategist at Willing Sweden. So just very short, we support employers and organizations to create very hands-on, activity-based strategies in workplaces, but we also support the government and different stakeholders to contribute in create new models and methods of how to get people closer to the labor market and how to make them more relevant for the labor market through networks and through something that we call multiple stakeholder approach. And that's something that we have seen very fruitful in the collaboration that we had. I just want to go very straight on to this, what that means. And the multiple stakeholder approach is do what you do best and try to find the complement, the right complement, that have the same values but also the same goal, and try to address it together. Because I think that sometimes within different sectors it can be a lot of competition, like I have the right solution, but I think that when we see a broader perspective and complement each other, I think that reach a more effective solution. In this process, it's also important to involve all the partners, all the parts that gonna be addressed by the solution, not just the people, the organization that need to provide the solution or gonna implement the solution, but also the target groups. And invite them not just only to do a analysis of what is needed right now. Invite them to be in the decision-making process and part of creating the solution. And why I'm just getting on the holistic part and talking about the multiple stakeholder approach is because it needs to be tailored to the different context that you need to put the solution into it. Because if we do some more generic process, it still need adaptation and have that, because our societies are changing so rapidly and the needs are changing constantly. So it's important to have a more flexible solution when you are trying to implement this. And also, when I'm talking, it's not just like when we created entry hub method, that is a method to get job seekers and employer closer to each other, but also to visualize their competence in a different way. We did a reference group. We invited private sector, public sector, unions. Unions are super important in Sweden because they have the better understanding on how and what rights do the refugees have when they reach the labor market. And that's important information that they need to have to make themselves more relevant for the job market. I think I'm going to leave it right here, but then in the conversation we can engage even more.
that for Hugo as well. Thank you so much.
Okay, my turn. So
Yeah, go ahead.
good morning. My name is Antigone. I'm currently project manager of a new pilot project in the city of Athens for the integration of refugees. But I also have worked in the city of Athens for the past 2.5 years in a field of refugee policy. So what I wanted to point out first is that two things I think are important when it comes to creating a partnership, at least from a city level. The first one is culture, and the other is political context. So in the case of Greece, I can say that it wasn't at all in our culture to work in partnerships. But the political context, the crisis, the financial crisis, and then the refugee crisis kind of made it impossible not to work without creating synergies. And in the case of the city of Athens, it became embedded in how we work. So we started working with foundations and civil society. So this partnership between local government, civil society, and the private sector foundations became really, now it's a given that this is the best way to do things. So this came out of the financial crisis, and during the refugee crisis, many organizations, international organizations, came to our city to help to deal with the situation, and many smaller organizations were scaled up, and so we had such a big variety of actors to work with, and at a certain point it became obvious that we need there's no point in each one doing what they know how to do best. We need to coordinate, and we need to have a common goal. So we created the Athens Coordination Center for Migrants and Refugees. So when it came to applying for this program that I'm currently managing, the Urban Innovative Actions gives you really the opportunity to find the best partnership that you can find to implement your idea. So we really had such a large pool of organizations to choose from, and I should actually describe our partnership. It's between it's the city of Athens, it's the University of Athens, which is involved in training. We really picked, the best team we could find when it comes to training, and then we picked the best people we could find in job counseling, and the best people we could find in housing. So CRS is our partner, Catholic Relief Services is our partner in housing, and International Rescue Committee is our partner in job counseling, and then we have an official partner in this program, which is the city itself and the citizens' initiatives that we have mapped during in the past 5 years. We really started working with civil society and mapping all these initiatives out there, formal and informal. So we wanted to have a holistic, let's say, approach in integration by working with all those people. And how did we choose them? Well, I guess it was also, sharing the same vision, because when you have such a large pool, you can't really, it's not a matter of being fair. You just need to click, especially around the pilot program. So what I can share with you so far, because our project has just started. So on the one hand, it's really fantastic to have the best of the best in each field, and to sit around the same table, and to each have so much experience in what you do, and really a multidisciplinary approach of integration is really what I think is needed. But when you test a new idea and when you pilot a new project, when you're not sure about where you're going, everybody falls back to their safety, to the way they have done things so far. And the same was also true for the city of Athens. We work in the neighborhoods of Athens, and actually, each one of us in the partnership, we at some point we were oriented towards what we usually traditionally do. So the municipality had an instinct to go towards the citizens and not the refugees. I mean, a team of the municipality, and then CRS had an instinct to focus on housing and say, why do we need all these other things? Let's give people housing, and then So I mean, that's the weakness, I guess, of a partnership in a new project is that you really need to stay focused and to remember that you really need to challenge yourself constantly to create towards the same goal. So this needs very, very good coordination. And of course, once this works, you know, it's once you get past the stage of you know, going beyond what you usually do, it's a fantastic pool of ideas that keep improving the project. And the initial idea was X, and now it became, you know, Y, Z, A, B, C, D. I guess, you know, this is my experience so far, and I think the biggest challenge that we will probably face, and I don't have the answer right now to how you can go past it, is that you know, partnerships with funding have an expiration date. So how can you make them sustainable? And this is a question that I think we all share here.
Yeah. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for sticking to those 5 minutes. I'm amazed. This has never happened to me in a panel where, yeah, there's Swedish, but Greece as well. So we've done a good job. But let me just summarize kind of what I've been hearing, and I want to comment on one piece, and then I'll ask a couple questions and then open it up if that sounds okay. So here's a few things that I've heard today. On the one hand, putting it in your strategy. I think Hugo mentioned that. Like, it has to be part of what your strategy is, what your culture is. Like calling it a multi-stakeholder approach, that's who we are, is very important, because I think it kind of shapes the organization. The second thing I heard was inviting to the decision-making process, involving people from the very beginning on how we shape and make the decisions, rather than shaping the process and then inviting partners in, which is often what we do, especially from a policy level, right? Because there's like these secret rooms where policies happen and then you invite them in. And that trend is changing, but I think that's key, and that's what I heard. Making it part of your culture is very important. The political context you talked about as well is really, sometimes there's situations where there's a moment or an opportunity for collaboration. Use those. I think migration, again, is one of those political moments that has actually provided opportunities for partnerships, which is really interesting. We don't talk about this a lot, but I think that's true. And also to create new goals that are shared, and a new vision that's shared, and revisit that vision. And then one other piece that was said in different ways is kind of, it's really important to identify and shore up the problem and the shared nodes. And in the case of Greece, and I remember Germany when the miscalled migration crisis started happening, a lot of people got together, and the problem seemed to be very clear, and that enabled partnerships. And in Hello Europe in Spain, it was very different, because, as you know, Spain committed to receiving very few refugees and received even less. And so when you talk to the different actors in the field, including government at different levels and the nonprofits, no one really knew there was a problem. Or we thought, no, we're doing a good job. Like in all the surveys, right? Spain's the most tolerant country, until you actually ask a migrant how they feel. And so what we did was we brought together 40 stakeholders that we hand chose. You know, the head of the migration department, I guess it's called, or directorate. We chose, you know, UNHCR representatives, IKEA just like not random, but very, very specific people, and 20 migrants that had been through different experiences, and actually spent a whole day together analyzing what a migrant's experience was like and where are the difficulties. And it was fascinating, because everyone came saying, yeah, we're doing a pretty good job, and they left saying, wow, we have this huge problem that we had never seen before. And that was our aim, is to have everyone kind of share a problem. So someone had given me really good advice, and said, with no offense to government, but I said, government will not collaborate until they're forced to, until they see that they can't make this happen without collaboration. And I think that's true for all sectors. And Antigone talked about that as well, right? In Greece, the problem was so clear, like, we have to work together. So I think that's a challenge, especially in countries that seem to have it under control. I'm thinking of, like, you know, Canada or other places. In fact, what was said yesterday about Canada was really interesting. Diversity is a fact, but we can't stop there, because we have a problem, which is inclusion, that we have to deal with. And so actually shoring up that problem without making it a huge crisis situation that blames the migrants, I think, is a huge challenge, but a very important challenge for partnerships. So that's more than probably I should have said. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, and if you don't like this question, you can talk about something else, but is, this is very theoretical in some ways, but when was a moment, with your partnerships where you realized, wow, this is a real partnership. We're actually working together. Because I think we often talk about partnerships and surely you're funding us and we're doing the work or whatever. But when were those moments when, one or two examples maybe?
Sorry, I still forget about that. I just want to comment about how you can make, what you said, the people or organization or stakeholders that are financing, how you can make it more concrete and get more also support for the longer term. In our cases, that has been to create concrete cases, evaluate constantly, and also as asking the people that are going to go through the solution, what has this actually helped you in your process of the labor market integration, and also make it interesting for all the stakeholders in terms of what kind of social and economical effects that this have, short term, long term, because when we have these concrete facts, it's impossible for the stakeholders to see this, that, oh, we need to address this in a very constructive and collaborative way. And another thing, the multiple stakeholder approach needs to happen parallel in different level, local, in the more regional part, but also at the same time at the government level, because you need to engage decision maker, policymakers, politicians. And I just want to address a very concrete effect of Sweden. Thanks to all the advocacy, all the initiatives that have been done in this area, we managed to influence politicians to take responsibility to create a lockout of the neo-Nazi party that we have. That's why it took us 7 months to create a government, because we know that what kind of politics that can take us back 10, 20 years, and that it was very important to do that kind of advocacy toward the politicians. That's just one concrete effect, but you can see it's a supply chain that you need to continue having all the time.
Thank you. I think it's what Hugo said was important. I would also like to give some examples because you also yesterday you mentioned extreme rights in Sweden. It's growing, and my family lives in France, and they're like, "Oh, congratulations! Now you're in France. It's been a long time now with Front National." And I think one successful thing about the union is that we have this big value of human rights, and we are very proud when we meet the civil society and the companies where we have representatives, and they said, okay, your values are too strong. So it's really, that's something that we have contact as well with the extreme right, because since we're not bound to any party, and they themselves said, oh, your values are so far away from ours. And we said, yeah, exactly. Working with immigration and refugees, refugee inclusion, and talking about diversity is good for business and also good for the humanity is not something they really are involved with. So I'm very proud of that. And another thing, I think, because you talked about, okay, how will we make sure things work in the long term? Of course, at trade unions, we want everybody to have collective agreement. 90% of the Swedes actually are working somewhere where they have collective agreements, which also means less inequality in pensions, because you get so much more if you work somewhere with collective agreements, and also with for women and men who wants to go on maternity leave. And we are very happy when we, for example, work with Willing Sweden and other startups, when we hear that newcomers also start to talk about starting companies, and of course eventually have collective agreements, because we think that is the strongest thing in Sweden, is the Swedish model. And if we are very harsh in terms of giving less money to create more jobs. We don't think that. We think it's important to have a good salary from the beginning for newcomers, so we don't create a new underclass. And I think that is not, maybe this was a third thing, but I think we are not compromising on that part, negotiating. So we are very clear on that part. As trade unions, we will always, we want good conditions for everybody. So yes.
Since again our project just started, I want to share with you some thoughts about the moment we realize we're a partnership in terms of a methodology. First of all, the first moment was when we found a common language, because we all knew that we are together for refugee integration, but then one organization speaks about clients, the other about students, and the other about beneficiaries, and the other one about active citizens. So and everybody thinks that their approach is the best. I mean, that's the reality, So finding a common language was a big challenge, and I think we're very happy. I think this came, after working together for maybe 3 to 4 months, we managed to find a common language. And the other moment where we're hopefully getting soon at is finding common ways to measure what we do. Because this is also, when you measure housing opportunities and, language learning and different things and different levels of integration, it's very hard to, again, it's very, very hard to measure integration, of course, for everyone. But again, in a partnership, it's you need to have to agree on a common set of, indicators, I guess, or to really find the right words to phrase what you're trying to do. And this is also, it's been a challenge, but we're really close. We're getting close to finding a common vision and.
Perfect. Just to also give a perspective, especially with the private sector, I think that a need that is, it's a big need in Sweden. There we have a lot of shortage in different sectors, healthcare, education, but also transport industries. And the shortage has also brought attention to the private sector to take an active role and enroll more, not just financially, but also we will, in those multiple stakeholder collaboration that are existing in Sweden. And now that was like, it started during the influx of the refugees 2015, but now I can say that at least many of the initiatives are financed partly by the private sector, and that's something that it's increasing. So we are trying to see the opportunities in our newcomers instead of saying this as a challenges, and that's something that is changing. The perspective is changing in the Swedish context as well.
So I have a lot of other questions, but I'd like to open up for a few questions from you, and then we'll figure out what to do next. So are there any questions from?
I'm always happy to start. So I'm going to ask, I guess, a straightforward, but perhaps not so straightforward question to all the panelists, because you brought so much into the discussion around networks, around smart networks. I hope now maybe we all sort of have a common understanding. So 2 questions for you. I guess for the panelists, what keeps you up at night? What's the biggest challenge? What are your biggest needs? And also, how can we better communicate? So communicate with the partners, communicate with our clients around the benefits of networks and the role that we can all play. So I just open it to you, and I'm interested to hear your views. Thank you.
I love your question. What keeps me up at night is actually the sense of belonging, because we had actually this hashtag for 1 year ago, det här är mitt land. It means this is my country, and it's like because it was once again questions, who is a Swede? And I think it's very important to be integrated, to actually feel at home. So that keeps me up at night when I hear, I was not born in Sweden, but I am first of all Swede, and then I'm a citizen of Europe and the world. But I have other friends I know who were born here, or friends' children, and they don't feel like Swedes. And I think that's a big problem. That keeps me up sometimes, because it makes you take a step back, and it's the individual's responsibility as well. But we have this landscape now in politics where we once again say you're only a Swede if you celebrate Christmas, Hanukkah, then you're not a Swede. And if you're from the north of Sweden, you have this farmer living in the snow, you're not a Swede. So I think that's something trade unions can work with, since we are based on ideology. So it also keeps me happy in the morning when I wake up, because I know we're on the right way. So I'm not so worried. And communication, well, be honest with your values. Don't be passionate, like you always say, Hugo. Talk with your heart. Be more French, and don't just talk about policies, boring. And young people, we know they love social media. Be there. Use the media. Don't let them use you. So I think you just don't compromise. Just do it. So, thank you.
Again, very interesting question, and what motivates me, I have two passions: inclusion and innovation, and I'm trying to combine those. And also to see that my country, I'm a very proud Swede Latino, and I see that there is a big possibility with Sweden and how we are strengthening each other with the influx of migrants, and it's becoming a very much more migrant country. Remember that Sweden has been a very homogeneous country, and the last 40 years has becoming very heterogeneous. So we are doing the change very fast, and what I see in the Swedish people is that we are very flexible for change, and that's something that is positive. The other thing, how can we create ownership in the multiple stakeholder approach? I think that first of all it's important to have and start a dialogue, invite different actors to the reference group, and in the reference group have discussion, have conflicts. Conflict create creativity and innovation, but it's also important to have inclusive leadership who can moderate these conversations. But sometimes when you someone say no, but I need this right now because this is my reality, and someone from the private sector say, no, but we can't do that. That costs too much. And then the public sector, yeah, but our policy says like this. Somewhere in the discussion and the dialogue, everybody's going to put their own perspective. And when you part and invite it to the table of decision, you're also creating ownership. And that's going to be easier to also say why you are part of it. The ownership's going to be more effective long term, but also short term. And also be very clear and be it's important that all the actors know and that we find the common goal, but also the common values why we are doing this.
Okay, so we all come from different organizations, perspectives, countries. To be honest, what keeps me up at night from working for the local government is bureaucracy. It really keeps me up at night. But to talk more about what we do and less, technical issues, I think, when you test a new path, when you work for a pilot, you always have the insecurity, at least at this stage, okay, because it's the beginning of the project, as I said. What if, it doesn't mean anything to the people? What if I'm completely wrong in my approach? So a way to get past this is that we chose to work with a action research methodology. So we design, we try things out, and we redesign, and that's what's great about this program and working on a new pilot, is that you have the time to reflect and to redesign. So it gives you the freedom to really adjust. I mean, 2 years ago when we wrote this program, the situation was different in Athens. Our ideas were different, and working in a partnership helps you really, improve the idea. But at the end of the day, when people come in the program, that's the reality shock. How do you call it? Now, regarding the communication, I think co-designing is a very important at every stage. So we really make sure that everyone understands what we do, has their input. It's hard to coordinate sometimes because, you end up having meetings where everybody says wait, this is not right, and I mean, sometimes it's too much, but you really need to go through this clash to mature the idea. We had a capacity building training where we all sat together and reflected on what we do and where we're going, and this helped a lot also. So yeah, I hope this answers your questions.
Can I have a comment?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I think that is very interesting to do that. And something that we have seen, just to present also a challenge in the communication in our processes, always it's been more difficult to talk to the public sector, especially because they have very structured guidelines, policies that sometimes are created here in Brussels and adapted into the member state countries. And one of them, who is very important stakeholder, is the employment agency. And it's very important to visualize how this gain their existence processes. So until you find the real concrete results and effects, that's when the actor is engaging even more. And also because bureaucracy sometimes is less flexible, I think it's also important to involve innovation and present innovation to public sector as an enabler. I think that is happening more and more in Sweden as well.
Yeah, so let me, I want to gather something, and that all of you referred to a little bit, but it's one of the challenges we find a lot, is that there's a lack of funding for the team building process for the partnerships. And I think this is an interesting recommendation for policy and other things. Often we're looking for projects that are already developed, that are already done, you know, and then go out and find a partnership in your own free time, and we'll figure it out. Whereas we found the more that, like, and I think you guys are pioneers at doing this in many ways, is funding and preparing and planning out a phase for actually just creating that partnership. In our case, it's often asking businesses, say, okay, we're ready to think about partnership, but first fund a few sessions where we can just meet and see if we like each other. You know, you're asking us to get married without any preparation. We have to do all the work. We don't have that funding. And so it's really hard to do, especially from a nonprofit perspective, right? Because you don't have the power in that conversation. But I think that's something that we're hearing here, is that there needs to be a process of really coming together, deciding what language to use, what the problem is, and that requires time and money. I think this is an example of that. This conference, in fact, is bringing together and starting to develop some of that. And then the other thing, I want to answer the question, what keeps me up at night, because we work with a lot of partnerships in many different countries, many different contexts. And what keeps me up at night, of course, is we're not doing enough, which I think leads to partnership again. Like, who is doing the kind of stuff that we're not good at? But secondly, migrants aren't at the decision-making tables. And this is a constant in every country. It doesn't matter, north, south, east, west. Countries where migrants come from, they're still not the decision makers. And how do we get them to the table in an equal way is one of the most challenging things for us, because mostly partnerships emerge from smart networks. But those that are in smart networks tend to be people that have time and resources to be there, that aren't necessarily the migrant organizations or the people on the ground. So you have to take an extra effort to reach out to these, and they're too radical sometimes, you know, they're too, or don't want to say anything other time, like they don't fit into what we think are perfect partners. And kind of we have to integrate into their culture sometimes. And I'm speaking from I'm an American who's been living in Europe, very privileged, from an organization that's very high up, but it takes a lot of effort to really understand how to partner with organizations that don't naturally fit. And I think that's a piece, again, that's very difficult to do, and I think there could be funding, there could be mechanisms to kind of enable that to happen. And I'll stop there because I'm going too far, but were there any other comments? I know you wanted to say another comment about that, or should we open up to another question?
I don't know if it's a question or it's just another perspective. So I come from Romania, a country where, well, of course, there are not many refugees. But still, we have approximately 5,000 people who are trying to make their way here. And I think it's a very important issue of the European Union to have the Eastern Europe assume its own responsibility. And at the same time, persuade refugees that they do have also a chance in integrating in this part of Europe. Because unfortunately, every effort depends a lot on the available resources that you have. This is one thing. The second thing is how accustomed are public institutions with variety. Eastern Europe is not that multicultural. Unfortunately, this is my perspective. Reason out of which most of public administration considers that immigrants and refugees are not their responsibility. Most of the times they're being directed towards the institution which is designated with the integration, with the immigration office, which are police officers who, well, their perspective on integration is doing it by force. They don't have the social, psychological, layer in the way they work with refugees. Reason why I think it's very important to have these partnerships. And I think that maybe a good opportunity will be when the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund in Europe, in the European Union, will be moved to the social funds, from my understanding. This will leave a good opportunity for other types of institutions to access European funds, and maybe through this develop this, be motivated as an incentive to start working in integration as well, not to have this attribution, to only one type of institution. That's it.
I wanted to add, because I'm in the European Commission working on integration, and just to clarify that in the future, integration, the long-run structural, will be indeed more the responsibility of structural funds, like the European Social Fund and Regional Fund, but the Asylum and Migration Fund will keep, and actually will increase according to the proposal from the Commission, will increase the allocation for integration more towards the early part of integration, so it will require a lot of coordination between funds. And we also, in the proposal of the Commission, it is also the partnership principle, so to have the Asylum and Migration Fund being part of these common principles that you need to consult and report, etc., involve partners, civil society organizations, local authorities. So this was in the proposal of the Commission, and that is now being negotiated, just to add a bit of information to your intervention. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that all the different funds that are provided for doing this kind of innovation pilot projects, I need to be open more for other types of actors and initiatives, because we have seen that at the beginning that we have been working with the Innovation Agency and the Ministry of Growth. And the Ministry of Growth, that is not that controlled by European legislation, had more flexibility to make startups to apply, because otherwise it's just municipalities or public actors that are the ones who can be the project owner, and I think that needs to be adapted into the new processes. But I also, what I want to take the opportunity to say that we need to exchange more good practices between the member states and all the institutions today that are represented here that have interesting good practices, create more dialogues between the different countries, and foremost also for the Eastern Europe countries. I think that's important to understand those countries that are more diversity, how we can learn from each other. I think that's important. Another thing is that invite in the very concrete, let the people, sometimes we are talking about the refugees and sometimes we are inviting them to the decision-making process, but I want also to continue to say that they need to be in the implementation process, because some of the results that we have seen is that when the refugee meet other refugees and they know the same language, they also can explain social cultural codes that is easier than and more effective than if a Swede or a person born in Sweden will provide that information. And concrete effects on that is that when that happens, it also reach a good the person get a good vibe of the process, and that can also spin off into the social networks. Refugees have very extensive transnational social networks on the social media platforms, and that can also reach out beyond the borders. And I think that sometimes that's even important, because it can give positive effects for the employer or for the initiative or for the government in general.
So is there one more yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Good morning. My name is Cynthia Tilden-Machlad. I teach in higher education in Berlin. I teach a course, International Migration. And my question is a little bit different. I'd like to know what your experiences are, or anyone else. for me, integration is more when a society embraces newcomers rather than the ability of newcomers to adapt to the society. And I'm worried a little bit about what I see. Many, many good programs exist in Germany, and there are many volunteers out in the field. But I still worry that we train migrants to be like us, and we aren't spending enough money, we're not spending enough time, we're not looking to see that we take society with us, those of us who are engaged in it. And I'm quite appalled at the lack of knowledge about migration, and that it's normal for people to be mobile for a whole battery of reasons, including being forced. So I was just wondering, if you look in this direction, how do we bring society with us? Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's very important what you say. I think we had some problems in Sweden since, again, what keeps me up at night, and the narrow way to see how to be a Swedish. But the strive and the hope and the curiosity in Sweden is you can be Jewish, you can be a Christian, you can be a Muslim, and you can eat falafel today, köttbullar, potatismos, Swedish meatballs tomorrow. And I think that is the urbanization as well. So now we are actually, that's why we talk with the Jewish community, we talk with, like you said, Hugo, we see migration as a big experience and also a competence. You should put that on your CV. Sometimes, when I was new in the union, I worked with CV and coaching, and that's what I always said. You should write where you were born or what you learned thanks to your background. So I think that, like you say, we have to open our arms more and talk about the advantages you have when you come from another culture. And we see some companies actually who have now, thanks to the collective agreement, they have negotiated so you can take leave on Hanukkah and you don't have only red 3 days like on Christmas. So that's some things we're discussing, and I think that's good. So I think I am more hopeful, I think, because we're on the right way. But of course, we should keep debating about who is a Swede, and the intersectionality, being a hybrid. You shouldn't just pick one identity. We should keep talking about that, I think. Thank you.
To add to that, because that is the challenge, I think. Someone challenged me yesterday who works with people with intellectual discapacities or different capacities, and he ended up saying it's more about us. What's the word we always use? Is inclusion, right? Us integrating into their culture than them into ours, because when they integrate into ours, they're excluded from basic processes, because go to integrated schools and sit in a corner and play with your tablet. He says no one wants that, but when you come to their schools and sit with them and learn how to, I don't know exact examples, but it was because it's a completely different field. But I was like, oh, that's it with migration. It's maybe we need to shift the narrative, start thinking about how do we integrate into their culture. Someone yesterday suggested, we were talking about Kitchen on the Run, which is a German project that goes to different places and they open a kitchen. They said it's such a challenge, because we translate from English or from German into Arabic, and it's great, but it's always like right behind. Someone said, why don't you do it in Arabic and translate into English? It's like, but so simple things, and of course there's contexts and places where that may not work, but how do we switch that conversation? I think is part of what partnerships bring to the table. When you actually have significant partnerships and someone can raise that question or can suggest something different.
I actually spend more time talking about our partnership than our project, which I presented in the previous panel. But our approach is to connect the traditional integration pillars to the neighborhood, and so we do parallel work with refugees and with locals, and we try to find collaborative projects or common grounds where they can work together for the city. So instead of focusing on each or either, we focus on the city, and we see how we can bring both communities closer around common goals. So I just wanted to share this, the idea that we're trying to work on right now.
Very spot on question and comment. And what I think that we need to be very honest that the European approach has been more into assimilation perspective, and even Sweden. So the thing is, like, I think it's a mind change also in Sweden because of the results that we are getting. That is more, instead of talking of challenges, start talking of the opportunities of what the migrants can contribute. And something that is very important to when you do this in your different projects is sometimes the government puts more money and funds into different target groups, but at the end of the day, those kind of solutions can also address a broader group, because we need to talk about class and the poverty that has been creating in our societies in Europe, because that's also what triggers the extreme right movements, and that's also a problem that we have in Sweden. And another thing that it's also important to address with this is that don't stay in just your capitals where you create the policies. Go out to the rural areas, talk to the people, dialogues, involve the municipality, because I think that when you can sow a little, like, how say man frö? Seed in the brains of people through communication and dialogue, I think that's a big ownership that people can also take with them in their own communities.
I want to build on that and ask, or go ahead, and I'll ask another question later, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks. My question is also related to this discussion. I was curious. I mean, I work for Eurodiaconia. We're a network of we represent a network of faith-based organizations in different countries in Europe, and many of our member organizations don't just work with migrants, but with many populations that are vulnerable. And some of the challenges that usually our service providers face is, this idea of pitting communities against each other, and this competition between different communities, like, oh, this project is only for migrants and refugees, but not for the homeless population or long-term unemployed. And many of the issues that they face are very similar. So I was wondering how you deal with this issue, and also if any of your projects are actually open to not just refugees and migrants, but if it's a training program, or is it open to people who are, for example, long-term unemployed? So you bring both communities together, and at the same time help with integration and understanding each other, and learning that many of the challenges that they face are very similar. Thank you.
Very good question and point. I think at the trade union we have so many activities, and in Sweden you have to be separately a member of the unemployment fund, but the trade unions complete the rest of the loss of salary. And we also have these activities about for everybody who is a member, and to talk about how to get back to the work, and we also have influence. We have, thanks to the trade unions, all trade unions in Sweden, the unemployment fund at the government, they raised the funds, so we have influenced that too. Like you said, Hugo, it's also a question of class. I think in that forum you meet somebody who's been in Sweden for a couple of years, but also people who have been born in Sweden and unemployed for a long time. So we do that too. But I think it's you have to also dare to have specific initiatives only for example, for migrants or LGBT communities, because it is a specific problem. And we have, unfortunately, a lot of discrimination cases, and they come to the union, so we represent many people. And but of course you can gather it, but I think sometimes it is also important to be clear on why you do this for only, we always get this kind of comments in social media, why do you care about immigrants? We don't have jobs for the young. So I think you have to be honest in why you're doing this, but of course not exclude a new group, not create a new underclass. That's very important what you say, and a big challenge, of course. Thank you.
Yes, I can just continue on concrete projects that we have done. We have a shortage in transport and transport industry drivers. So PostNord, Scandinavia's biggest mailing and logistic transport company, has now collaborated with the employment agency and the educators, trainee. So the thing is, like, the shortage is around 7,000 coming years, just for PostNord 1,000, but in 10 years around 50,000 and growing. That's because of the digitalization. We shop online even more. So the thing is, like, the refugee, newly arrived and newcomers are a too short group to cover that shortage. So then the initiative needs to do employer branding for a larger group. And that's Swedes, people that have been born in Sweden, that is unemployment or have been unemployment for 10, 15 years. So because of the necessity of finding people into the shortage position, we need to have more holistic approach. And that's also because we do advocacy to the politicians and to the policymakers, that we cannot just put one group, because exactly what you say, we cannot put groups toward groups, because that creates and trigger conflict that is not very good for the employers.
In our case, as I said, our goal is to find a common ground for action between locals and refugees. Of course, our trainings are more focused to the refugee population, and our methodology for approaching the neighborhood and the local community is totally different. But at the end, I mean, we also have some seed funding that we are aiming to give to collaborative projects that or social enterprises or anything that could come up out of this, meeting point between the two communities. And I also wanted to point out that it's very interesting also to see that the neighborhoods, between neighborhoods, we see so many differences between the neighborhoods of Athens. So it's really hard to have, one approach, and it's very interesting to see how, if you really, zoom in the city and the neighborhood, you have so many different ways of bringing the two sides together, and that's what we're really trying to work on.
Hi, I know our time is tight, but I have an observation and a question. My name is Dan Costello. I'm the Ambassador of Canada to the European Union. And this is a fascinating discussion, which reminds me of my observation, I suppose, is that it's just remarkable to me and frustrating that the high-level debate in the headlines is always so toxic, but the discussion among practitioners is so hopeful and optimistic. Because it's practical. And that's why I think what Antigone has said about project-based integration is a really profound point, because it seems to me it's the only way to break the lock on the public discourse that seems to be held by those who regard identity politics as identity as a static thing that we have to crouch and defend against invasion and so on. Whereas project-based talk is practical, and it engages various partners, and it allows us to think of identity implicitly, not explicitly, in much more dynamic terms. It makes me think of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's comment in his last speech at the UN when he said, my country, Canada, is a work in progress. And we really do want to welcome people to Canada who want to help us build our country. And I've recently heard, private sector people, for example, say, well, we actually need people who will help us build our company. And so I think breaking this toxic national narrative is going to require bringing practitioners together, which is why talking about partnering is so important. So if I think of that project-based integration work that you do, which is so profoundly transformative, then how do we bring partners together? So my question then, forgive me for the long observation, is what's your one bit of takeaway advice? Maybe I'm helping Kenny with his wrap-up. to partners, but take it, if you will, in three levels: to private sector partners, to public sector partners, and to other social partners. What's your one takeaway bit of advice you would leave us with on how to find partners and work with them best?
That was exactly my question. It really was. Is how does this shape the narrative as well? Like, how do these partners change the narrative of migration? So let's end with that and maybe have final comments. Thank you so much. Those are great.
Thank you for your question. It's very interesting, and I would like to add that my cousins came from Iran to Canada when they were like 18, but they felt like Canadians after like 3 weeks. And when they visited us in Sweden, I was like, "Are you sure you've been there only for 2 years?" And now they work at Silicon Valley, and they're very successful. But I think what you say is important. I would like to say that you have to be very hard and clear on. I come from the finance sector from the beginning, so I like to measure everything. And I think you have to, if the board of administration or the management team said, no, we can't like have measured goals for diversity, or then you have to keep talking about it. So I think that's one success story that we see, is that on every level you have to follow up, and you have to dare to say, oh, I failed, let's do this again. We didn't. Now we still have a 100% white management team. Something must be wrong, because we need more diversity. We know that diversity groups, they sell more, and the customers like it. So I think you have to talk more business, and like you say, just accept that there are problems, but also put the strategy into the business. And because we also saw OF that I mentioned, when they had this trainee program, they had a lot of suspicious colleagues internally who was like, are you sure that these refugees have the competence level for engineers? So I think you have to be prepared also for people who won't believe in you, and just keep doing it until you succeed. So thank you.
I think, I hope, in 2 years I might regret saying this, but keep it as diverse as possible, challenge the idea, bring different visions around the table. For example, now, thinking about how we formed our partnership, I think we could have had the private sector on the table, which we didn't, mainly for bureaucratic reasons again, but yeah, at the end of the day, I think bringing very different visions around the table can only enrich the goal, the final goal.
Yes, of course. I'm going to start with the private sector. I think that my recommendation to the private sector is to invest more, take more responsibility. In Sweden, we have had a society where the government takes a lot of responsibility. I think the private sector, it's time for them to step up, and that can effective all the processes that we're doing together. For the public sector, oversee your internal processes. I think that it needs to be happen a change management process in some of the institutions, especially the institutions that can provide and can put newcomers closer to jobs, employment agencies, and settling in organizations. For the civil society and social entrepreneurs, stop seeing competence. Stop focusing on continuing the funding. I think the result is even better, and that's gonna come in the way. And also do the package in a good way so you can inspire other actors. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd like to address that as well, and I think it kind of helps us to wrap up. But one thing, so with our Hello Europe work, we were working with organizations to help them scale. And in that process, we realized sometimes scaling is replicating. Like when I build this organization, like when an American organization tries to come to Germany, and I say try because it's very difficult, it is, we're going to bring this organization and put it here. When a German organization wants to come to Spain or Greece, that doesn't work, because it's such a different context, and also there's a resistance. Like, what are you Germans? What are you, like, you ruined our country. What are you going to do? And I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but it's the feeling often, and it just doesn't work. There has to be a different setting. But as we grew into different countries and started seeing a lot of these project-based organizations, we realized something, that they're contributing to the negative narrative around migrants. Let me explain very briefly. We sell problems as nonprofits. That's what we pitch. Tell people there's this many people dying, that's why we need your money. Right? That's basically what we do, and we do that very well, or we should if we're still surviving. with this situation, part of the problem of the narrative is we're saying these poor objects of pity that have no power need our help. So help us. And there's three responses, right? The first response is a human rights, right? Okay, altruistically we'll help them. That's kind of in the German response at the beginning. Then there's the response of then we should close the borders because this problem is too big for us. Or there's the economic response, right? Well, we need them to give us money, so let's bring them in, or to create money. None of those actually respond to the problem. What the narrative needs to change, and in Ashoka we'd say for them to be seen as change makers. Or as empowered migrants, to use shared language. That's one of my learning, to stop using the Ashoka words, use big words. And how do we empower them? So what we realized is we had this network of community-based projects. Let's help them change that narrative. Let's help ourselves change that narrative and start even selling and pitching their problems or their initiatives differently. And I think that's one of the partnership areas that's been so unique. And then one other thing that I've heard us all say is when real partnerships emerge and it really starts working is when you force yourself or your organization is forced to need partners and to need partnerships. And this is like a principle in community-based development, like when you move into a new neighborhood and you're trying to be the white guy that's helping the other people. The only way it works is when you need to ask them for help as well. And I think we know this at a very practical level, and real neighboring happens when both neighbors need help from each other, not just when the rich neighbor comes in to bring resources. That just doesn't work. So how do we do that with our organizations, the way we plan them, with funding, with policies, to make it so that partnership has to happen? And it's a scary question to ask because it means kind of tying your arms behind your back in certain areas to force yourself to have these partnerships. And I think policy has a big role there. But it's very difficult too because you can also make it so cumbersome, that it's impossible to partner. But I think that's the big challenge. And to end, we're right at time, but I'd love for you all kind of individually to think of what are some of the principles of partnerships and how could that work, and in your evaluation about this conference to let us know as well, because one of the big challenges I know is putting together conferences like this or moments where you can bring everyone together. And it's really hard to build partnerships sometimes when there's 4 people on a stage and everyone else is listening, or maybe not. I don't know, but if you have ideas, or how can we create more spaces where partnerships can emerge, let us know because I think or let the organization know because I think there's a huge interest in making this happen. But the structures that we built aren't necessarily the best for building partners. Not that we've built the structures we're coming into. So please suggest stuff because we have to do this. There's no other way out of this than partnering together, which is the positive and negative view at the same time. So thank you so much. I'd love to thank our panelists for sharing.